Haisai, wanne Sid Yaibing, Cha Ganju. Welcome everyone, I'm your host Sid. I hope you're staying safe and your health is good. Thanks for your continuing interest in this channel. Please help out this channel by subscribing. Click on that red subscribe ball in the lower right. Also, share this video with others via email, Facebook, Twitter, or some other social media. This is the one way you can help this channel to grow the number of people that speak Uchinaaguchi. The background today is Hedo Misaki. Hedo Misaki is the northernmost point on the island of Okinawa. Hedo Misaki faces the South China Sea on the west and the Pacific Ocean on the east. On a clear day, Yorong Island to the north can be seen. In this picture, you see the monument at Hedo Misaki commemorating the end of the US occupation and the return of Okinawa to Japan. Hedo Misaki is a popular tourist spot and a great place to take a picture the next time you are in Okinawa. Okay, let's start. Today's topic is Uchinaaguchi verb fundamentals. The purpose of this video is to introduce some basic knowledge of Uchinaaguchi verbs so that it will be easier to determine the conjugation of verbs introduced in the vocabulary videos. Without this knowledge, it will be difficult to correctly guess what the verb conjugations are. Uchinaaguchi verb conjugation is very difficult compared to Japanese. Much harder. The information that will be presented today will be linguistically technical, but will help when we start our verb conjugation videos. The first topic of discussion will be the verb correspondence between Uchinaaguchi and Japanese. Now that we have a couple of videos where we learned new verbs, some of you may have wondered if there is any correspondence between Japanese and Okinawan verbs. The answer is that basic forms of many Okinawan verbs, although not all, can be predicted from Japanese verbs in a regular fashion. One goal of this video is to serve as a guide, but not as a rule to help you with new Okinawan verbs. The base form of Japanese verbs always ends with a character from the third row of the hiragana chart. Uchinaaguchi verbs will end with a or ing sound. We will discuss the relationship between Japanese and Uchinaaguchi verbs. We will visit each third row hiragana character and match it with the corresponding Uchinaaguchi sound. First, we start with the ku ending verbs. Japanese verbs ending in ku correspond to Uchinaaguchi verbs ending with chung. This is the base form and the only form that would be listed in the dictionary. If you attempt to use another conjugation form of the verb, it will not be found. Let's look at an example. A Japanese ku ending verb is kaku, which means to write. In Uchinaaguchi, it is kachung. So for our example, kaku corresponds to kachung. Next is the gyou ending verbs. Japanese verbs ending in gyou correspond to Uchinaaguchi verbs ending in jung. Let's look at an example. A Japanese gyou ending verb is oyogu, which means to swim. In Uchinaaguchi, to swim is wijung. So for our example, oyogu corresponds to wijung. Next is the su ending verbs. Japanese verbs ending in su correspond to Okinawan verbs ending in sung. Let's look at an example. A Japanese su ending verb is nasu, which means to give birth. In Uchinaaguchi, to give birth is nasung. So for our example, nasu corresponds to nasung. Next is the tsu ending verbs. Japanese verbs ending in tsu correspond to Okinawan verbs ending in chung. Let's look at an example. A Japanese tsu ending verb is tatsu, which means to stand. In Uchinaaguchi, to stand is tachung. So for our example, tatsu corresponds to tachung. Next is the nu ending verbs. A Japanese verb that ends in nu corresponds to an Okinawan verb ending in nung. Let's look at an example. A Japanese nu ending verb is shinu, which means to die. Actually, shinu is the only verb with a nu ending. In Uchinaaguchi, to die is shinung. So for our example, shinu corresponds to shinung. Next is the bu ending verbs. Japanese verbs ending in bu correspond to Okinawan verbs ending in bung. Let's look at an example. A Japanese nu ending verb is tobu, which means to fly. In Uchinaaguchi, to fly is tubung. So for our example, tobu corresponds to tubung. Next is mu ending verbs. Japanese verbs ending in mu correspond to Okinawan verbs ending in mung. Let's look at an example. A Japanese nu ending verb is yomu, which means to read. In Uchinaguchi, to read is yumung. So for our example, yomu corresponds to yumung. Next is the ru ending verbs. Verbs in Japanese ending in ru correspond to Okinawan verbs ending in yung for the Shuri dialect and ing for the Naha dialect. Although Uchinaguchi uses the Naha dialect as the standard, both the yung form and the ing form are commonly used. However, the verb form that will be found in the dictionary is ing. If you're wondering, none of the previous examples have this ing form. Let's look at an example. A Japanese ru ending verb is toru, which means to take. In Uchinaguchi, to take is tuing. So for our example, toru corresponds to tuing. Next is the u ending verbs. Japanese verbs ending in the syllable u correspond to the Uchinaguchi verbs ending with ing for the Naha dialect and yung for the Shuri dialect. A word of note is Japanese verb must end with the syllable u. In other words, ending with a double vowel with the last vowel being u. Once again, the verb ending with ing or the Naha verb is the form that will be found in the dictionary. Also, the Uchinaguchi ing ending verbs are only associated with Japanese ru and u ending verbs. Let's look at an example. A Japanese u ending verb is warao, which means to laugh. In Uchinaguchi, to laugh is waraing. So for our example, warao corresponds to waraing. These are all the correspondences between Japanese and Uchinaguchi verbs. The next topic is verb types. In Uchinaguchi, there are 4 verb types. This information is based on the Okinawan English wordbook by Mitsugu Sakihara. I have not seen this verb type classification used in other books, in either English or Japanese. I have also not seen another systematic attempt to show how to derive Uchinaguchi verb conjugations, so this is why I have chosen to show this system. These verb types are classified based on Uchinaguchi verb endings. Type 1 Uchinaguchi verbs end with ing. As we have just learned, this corresponds to Uchinaguchi verbs corresponding to Japanese verbs ending with ru and u. Type 2 Uchinaguchi verbs end with ung. These would be Uchinaguchi verbs that correspond to Japanese verbs that end with ku, gu, su, tsu, nu, bu, or mu. Type 3 Uchinaguchi verbs end with ung. There is just one type 3 verb, which is wung. Type 4 Uchinaguchi verbs are irregular verbs that do not follow expected conjugations. In Japanese, there are just 2 irregular verbs, suru and kuru. However, in Uchinaguchi, there are many irregular verbs. Uchinaguchi irregular verbs do not correspond to any Japanese verb endings. A word of caution, Japanese verbs has an established classification of 3 verb types, but do not associate these verb types with Dr. Sakihara's Uchinaguchi verb types. The 2 types are completely different. To make it interesting, Type 1 and Type 2 Uchinaguchi verbs have subtypes. Type 1 verbs have 6 subtypes. First is subtype 1A1. Type 1A1 verbs end with a vowel that is not a followed by ing. An example is the word take, which is tuing in Uchinaguchi. The stem of the verb is tu. Stems will be important as we talk about conjugations. Next is type 1A2. Type 1A2 verbs end with the vowel a followed by ing. An example is the word laugh, which is waraing in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is wara. Next is type 1B1. Type 1B1 verbs end with a syllable chi followed by ing. An example is the word wear, which is ching in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is chi. Next is type 1B2. Type 1B2 verbs also end with the syllable chi followed by ing. An example is the word cut, which is ching in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is chi. Some of you may be thinking, what is the difference between type 1B1 and type 1B2 verbs since they look identical? There actually is a difference, and we will see that some of the conjugations for type 1B1 and type 1B2 verbs are different, although the base form is the same. Next is type 1C1. Type 1C1 verbs end with the syllable D followed by ing. An example is the word meaning able to read, which is yumading in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this word is yumadi. Next is type 1C2. Type 1C2 verbs end with the syllable D followed by ing. An example is the word to insert, which is idiing in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is idi. Type 2 Uchinaguchi verbs have 9 subtypes. First is type 2A1. Type 2A1 verbs end with the syllable jung. An example is the word swim, which is wi jung in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is wi. Next is type 2A2. Type 2A2 verbs end with the syllable jung. An example is the word wear, which is kangjung in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is kang. Next is type 2A3. Type 2A3 verbs end with the syllable jung. An example is the word tie up, which is kunjun in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is kung. Next is type 2B1. Type 2B1 verbs end with the syllable chung. This chung is related to verbs corresponding to Japanese ku verbs. An example is the word write, which is kachung in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is ka. Next is type 2B2. Type 2B2 verbs end with the syllable chung. This chung is related to verbs corresponding to Japanese tsu verbs. An example is the word stand, which is tachung in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is ta. Once again, although type 2B1 and 2B2 verbs both end in chung, we will see that some of the conjugations of these two types are different. Next is type 2C. Type 2C verbs end with the syllable sung. An example is the word birth, which is nasung in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is na. Next is type 2D. Type 2D verbs end with the syllable bung. An example is the word fly, which is tubung in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is tu. Next is type 2E. Type 2E verbs end with the syllable mung. An example is the word read, which is yumung in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is yu. Next is type 2F. Type 2F verbs end with the syllable nung. An example is the word die, which is shinung in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is shi. Next is type 3. Type 3 verbs end with the syllable An example is the word exist, which is wung in Uchinaguchi. The stem of this verb is wu. Lastly, we have type 4 verbs, which are irregular verbs that do not conjugate as expected. I've selected 8 irregular verbs that we will discuss the conjugations for in our verb conjugation videos. Irregular verbs do not have a set ending sound or syllable. I will just go through the 8 irregular verbs that we will discuss in future verb conjugation videos. The first irregular verb is ang, which means exists for inanimate objects. Next is sung, which means do. Ichung, which means go. Chung, which means come. Yung, which means say. Injung, which means see. Umuing, which means think. Yang, which means is. I did not mention any stems since irregular verbs don't follow systematic conjugation rules. For irregular verbs, there is no stem which is consistent across all its conjugations. All Uchinaguchi verbs will fall into one of these 17 types or subtypes. The future routine when discussing verb conjugations will be to use 22 out of these 24 verbs as representative for each verb type. I will omit verb type 1C1 and 1C2. I will instead treat these as conjugation forms since every verb has a 1C1 potential and 1C2 passive form. So these two forms will be discussed, but not as a verb type, but as a conjugation form. I will then use the verb types that we discussed today and relate it to the verb conjugation forms from Dr. Nakamatsu's book, Uchinaaguchi Sabira, and fill in the gaps. We'll see how this goes, since the material from each author is unique and doesn't correlate with each other. I'll try to merge the two ideas together since the combined info makes what I believe is a nice systematic method to present verb conjugations. In future videos, we'll discuss the verb conjugation formula for each subtype so we can derive the correct conjugation for any regular verb. When I say regular, I mean not irregular. For irregular verbs, there will be no formula, and the conjugations for these verbs must be memorized. So our videos to learn Uchinaaguchi verbs will follow two parallel paths. The first path will be verb vocabulary videos, where we'll continue to learn a set of 6 new verbs with the present, past, casual, and polite forms. The second path will be videos to learn verb conjugations. In these videos, we'll learn general formulas for each verb subtype so we can derive the conjugations for the new verbs that we learn. Future verb vocabulary videos will state verb subtype information in the video so that you will know which formula to apply. For past verb vocabulary videos, namely video 13 and 23, I will add that information in the description area. This video sets us up to start learning verb conjugations to make our Uchinaaguchi usage much richer. Thanks for listening to the end. If you found this video interesting, please share this video via email, Facebook, Twitter, or some other social media with your family and friends. Also, like if you enjoyed this video. This, along with comments, are the only way I know if the videos were appreciated. So this concludes this video. As always, thank you for viewing. Mata yaasai.